Good morning. All right. For, for those of you who are on the wall, I would go sit down. All of you. Just Chuck stays. Just Chuck. Y'all sit down. We're not going to do, this is a rules committee meeting, not rules where we set calendars. Well, good morning. I'm glad you are here. If you don't mind, please bow with me. Gracious Heavenly Father, here we are, getting close. Stay with us and lead us and guide us. Let us do things that please you. Forgive us when we don't. Keep your hand on us. Get us through these next three. We love you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Okay, this is a hearing. This is a hearing for Mr. Huffstetler on SR 195. You should have a copy of it on your desk. It's a resolution. Mr. Huffstetler, you're on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm coming before you today to request your favorable consideration of Senate Resolution 195, which is submitted pursuant to the Article 5 of the United States Constitution, calling for a convention of states limited to the single subject of term limits. And this shouldn't be unfamiliar to this body because in 2014, we overwhelmingly passed 5 separate pieces of Article 5 legislation. One of those pieces, SR 736, called for an Article 5 convention to address several subjects, including term limits for federal officials. So SR 195 is similar to SR 736, which we passed, except that any convention called pursuant to it would be limited solely to consideration of a congressional term limits amendment. I filed SR 195 in the Senate last session. It passed overwhelmingly, and a congressional term limits amendment has wide bipartisan support. It's been endorsed by President Trump and by Georgia Senator David Perdue. Democratic Florida State Senator Geraldine Thompson came to the Capitol and asked the Democratic caucus to support it. In addition to the Georgia Senate's overwhelming support, I know there's been a whip count supplied to leadership showing a strong majority of the Republican House caucus here supporting it and at least 19 Democratic representatives. And as important, I would say, is the people of the state of Georgia overwhelmingly support term limits for members of Congress. A poll of 500 likely Georgia voters showed 82% of all voters supported it. It was bipartisan, with 87% of all respondents that identified themselves as Republican supporting it, 74% of Democrats supporting it, and 85% of independents. And this supports the desire of the people to propose a congressional term limit amendment using the Article 5 Convention of States process. And then when they were asked the question, do you actually support a constitutional convention to do this, 80% approved that as well. So given that Congress has had numerous opportunities to propose such amendments and have failed to do so, it's appropriate that the states exercise their power under Article 5. And as we saw in the 2016 campaign, the citizens are frustrated with the way the federal government is operating. Many perceive Washington to be run by institutional politicians. You know, you look here in your Georgia House districts, you've got 50,000 members. You see them and talk to them regularly in the grocery store, in restaurants, at church. And the people feel close to their House members here. In Washington, it's 750,000 people that they represent. They spend most of their year in Washington. They are, unlike this body, full-time politicians. It takes millions of dollars to run one of those campaigns, and it's difficult to impossible to mount a successful challenge to this. So with this, over 90% of those incumbents are returned. Now contrast that with this citizen House legislature part-time here. You've had 40% turnover since 2014 in this body. We don't need term limits at the state level for these reasons, and many of the voters believe that congressional term limits provide an additional check and balance. Now, as of 1995, 24 states had proposed and had passed legislation limiting the number of terms for their congressional, Senate, and House members, but they were found unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision that said the only way to establish these term limits is by a constitutional amendment. So SR 195 would simply allow Georgia and other states to begin the discussion over how we can make Washington more responsive to the citizens who feel forgotten and overlooked by their federal government. It has the bipartisan supermajority support of our constituents, and I would urge your support and vote in favor of SR 195. And with that, I'll be glad to take any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Willard.
Thank you, Senator, for the resolution. Here I am.
There you are.
Thank you. How many states thus far have passed a resolution for the calling of a convention for this purpose? Do you know?
Well, that can vary. For those that have passed is a little over 20. Some of those, because they're intermingled with other subjects, there could be some question about whether they have to redo it again. But the single subject one recently, we've only had about 4 or 5 on that, but over 20, I believe, is the number.
And what's the percentage that's required? Do you recall?
It takes, I believe it's 34 states we would have to have
Thank
to pass that, yeah.
Thank you.
So we are a ways off from that.
Any other questions for Mr. Huffstetler?
Thank you very much.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we call, where's David? David Goldenshoe to testify. Yes. David is from up near Rome. He's been working on this issue and others for years. So, David, you're on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name again is David Goldenshoe. I'm a lawyer from Rome. I'm a constitutional policy advisor to the Heartland Institute Center for Constitutional Reforms. I've been very involved in the Article 5 movement nationwide. I've probably traveled to 26 states. I've probably given presentations to legislators from 45 or more states. So if you do have any questions, please send them this way. I can help you with this. You know, as far as the Article 5 process goes, you know, from time to time we do hear about concerns about a runaway convention and things of that nature. I just remind you, we had just thorough debate on that issue in 2014, and the Georgia legislature properly came down on the right side when you passed 5 different Article 5 pieces of legislation there. I had the opportunity, along with Senator Huffstetler and Representative Barr, to attend the first convention of states that's been held since 1861 this past September in Arizona. And what we found out is when legislators and a few of us outsiders come together, we follow the rules. And so any concern that anyone may have about a runaway convention, we proved in September in Arizona, simply can't and won't happen. The big issue I hear here in Georgia is the 2 concerns. One is that somehow if term limits are passed at the congressional level, it'll give more power to bureaucrats. The second lesson I hear, or the second issue I hear, is that, well, gosh, if we support term limits at the federal level, God, don't we have to support it at the state level? And let me address both of those very quickly. First of all, Georgia does not need term limits. As Senator Huffstetler pointed out, You've had a 40% turnover rate in this body just in the last 4 years. Big differences, as I like to say, to compare federal term limits with state term limits is to compare apples, not with oranges, but with mosquitoes. They're just not even in the same universe. As Senator Hostetler pointed out, you are accountable every day to your people. And if I decide to run against Representative Dempsey, which I will not do, but if I ever decided to do it, I can go knock on the door of every single voter in the city of Rome and get to know them. That doesn't happen at the federal level. Once you get elected to Congress at the federal level, it's the closest thing to tenure that you can count on virtually because of the cost, because of the size of the districts, etc. What term limits will do in any term limit amendment that might eventually get proposed is going to be very generous with the term limits. The idea behind term limits is to remove power from just a few institutional politicians in Washington. That's not what our founders intended. They intended power to be spread out at the federal level among representatives from the various states. So while term limits will allow for a turnover at the leadership level in Washington, it's not going to have a huge impact at the average level. As it is now, it's about 10 to 12 years that most congressmen serve. But if you look at leadership, it's in the 20, 25 plus year. So that's what the idea behind term limits is. It's supported, as Senator Hostetler pointed out, by President Trump, by Senator Perdue. By passing this resolution, you will help Senator Perdue in the following way. He, in a bipartisan way, supports SJR 2, which is a term limits resolution pending in the Senate. And each time a state passes one of these resolutions, it puts a little bit more pressure on Congress to have to consider that issue itself. And we've seen that happen in the past with other Article 5 movements. We hope it'll happen with the Balanced Budget Amendment movement that's at 28 states. So you can help us in Washington bring about the change that the President wants that has bipartisan support, believe it or not, there. So, so for that reason, it's not the same to compare federal and state term limits. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I will certainly open the floor for any, or I'm available to answer any questions that anyone may have.
Mr. Setzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the gentleman, thank you for being here with us, and thank you for your involvement in the process. Concern I've got is, I know sometimes the perfect is the enemy of the good. I'm not hostile to what you're saying in principle. I just don't know what I'm voting for here. I think personally an 8-year term limit would be harmful. I think an 8-year term limit would be exactly what you said. I think that would support empowering bureaucrats as opposed to elected officials who take a couple of terms to get on their feet and really get the expertise. I tend to believe that a 16-year term limit would be more appropriate. I just don't know what this resolution does because it does not require that. It's an open-ended convention. I don't know exactly what the question is we're considering.
May I respond, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Those are both great questions and the ones that we most frequently hear. First, the way the process works, the way our founders set it up is first we have to call the convention, and once that convention is called, and again, we're only I think 2 or 3 states have passed these a proposal strictly for term limits. There's another 12 states that have passed a proposal that includes term limits in it, and then there's another 8 to 12 states beyond that that have passed broader applications where term limits could be included. But we're a long way away from getting to 34. But when we get to 34, the wonderful thing is there's going to be this tremendous national discussion at the water coolers at work about what should the level be. Should it be 8 years? Should it be more than that? And like you, I totally agree with you. 8 years is simply not long enough. Even though most congressmen already have had the opportunity to work in their state houses and therefore kind of hit the ground running, that's too short. And what I can tell you from having talked to literally hundreds of legislators all over the country is that's not what's going to get proposed. It's going to be something probably a minimum of 12, probably in the 12 to 18 year range, and then 2 to 3 terms in the Senate as well. And the reason that that's going to be required is the concerns you have. You have to get 38 states to ratify this. If they're too short, you'll never get 38 states to ratify it. So you're going to have to be very generous in that amount. There's other things. It's going to have a grandfather provision in it in all likelihood, because every state has a favorite son that they don't want to term limit out. So you're going to have to put that into it. The convention, when it meets, it could be you, it could be others representing Georgia. When they meet, they're going to come together and they're going to talk about that very issue. If they come up with a proposal that you don't agree with, when it comes back to Georgia for the ratification process, it would be appropriate for Georgia not to agree with it. So that's a discussion in terms of what the final amendment's going to look at. That's the discussion that goes down the line. Right now, we just need to vote to have the discussion.
Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for your information. Just a couple of questions. First, you've mentioned Senator Perdue.
Yes, sir.
What other members of the Georgia delegation have signed on to this is the first part. The second part is, how will you deal with the time spent, 2 years for representatives, 6 years for senators, and I've heard your assurances, but what's to prevent a runaway convention with all of the amendments, a runaway convention? I've been to a few conventions. They seldom go as planned, but if you would.
Well, I mean, it's highly, a convention of states, which is a coming together of legislators. We just did that in Arizona. It's not the same as a convention for a political party. Those are two different animals as well. There's a set of rules. Just like when this body comes together, it doesn't typically run away, which is why you have such a long calendar here today. Y'all move at a very slow and deliberate process, and our experience looking at the more than 40 conventions of states that have occurred historically, one has never run away. It's never happened. So there's no reason to believe it will happen now, and it certainly didn't happen this past September. So that would address the runaway convention, but there was where does the rest of the delegation stand? We haven't polled the rest of the delegation. When Senator Perdue ran, he ran on the platform of supporting term limits, and he's a supporter of the amendment currently in Congress. So naturally, he is someone we've gravitated to talk to about this. I can't tell you what the rest of the congressional body is. Again, this is a state process, so it would not necessarily be something that you would typically weigh in with your congressional delegation on. I have a list here of multiple Republican and Democratic members of the Senate and House, as well as President Obama supported this during his time in office. So it's a very bipartisan effort.
It's our delegation you're talking about. You have a list.
I would have to go through to see where we are on our. Is there someone in particular you're concerned about?
Well, always your own, but I'd certainly like to know about the whole and address the times, 2 against 6 years for senators.
Well, the way it will work is there'll be a separate rule for each one. And so for the House, in all likelihood, again, there's lots of different ways we could write this amendment. And that will be part of this discussion that I've mentioned to you before. But in all likelihood, based on my sense of the pulse of the Article 5 movement, in the House it would be 6 to 9 terms that would be the limit. It would be somewhere in that range, which would be 12 to 18 years. And then in the Senate, it'll probably be 2 to 3 terms. I personally think it'll be 3 terms.
Mr. Williamson.
Thank you. I appreciate your efforts on this, but you've already referred several times to the intentions of our founding fathers.
Yes, sir.
Would you not agree that the problem essentially started with the state's ratification of the 17th Amendment? And if you do agree that that's really where the train started going off the tracks, wouldn't it take out all ambiguity about the question that Representative Williams just raised about terms and all that if you just simply repealed the 17th Amendment and put the power to appoint state senators back to the state legislatures?
Yes, sir. 3 or 4 things. First of all, it probably went off track when we didn't adopt the only amendment of the Bill of Rights that didn't get adopted. There were 12 Bill of Rights. 11 of them have been adopted. The one that wasn't was the one intended to limit House districts to no more than 50,000. The idea of the founders was that our Congress people would be accountable to the people. We don't have that anymore, and that's one reason why term limits is a substitute for that. As far as the 17th Amendment goes, there were good reasons why the 17th Amendment was passed. There was tremendous corruption in the appointment of senators at that time among the states. And so the people, there was literally a people uprising. Now, in retrospect, was that the best way to do it? Did the law of unintended consequences kick in? I think you can make a strong argument to that fact. Where we're at, though, is this. We have limited options on what we can do to help change Washington. Washington will not fix itself. I have senators and congressmen saying to me, begging us to be successful in the Article 5 movement. There are probably only 2 amendments that we have a strong chance at passing through the regular amendment process, and it will require the states to propose them. One is the Balanced Budget Amendment, where 28 states have already opposed that. This is the other one. I again remind you, what we're talking about now is passing a resolution to start the discussion, not to end it, but to start it. And that's where we need your support. That's where the senator needs your support, and we hope you'll provide that for us today.
Ms. Hughley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want clarification on this convention that you speak of that happened in September.
Yes, ma'am.
Who represented Georgia and who sponsored that?
Okay, the convention, we have a history of conventions being called throughout the history of our country, and a convention can be called at any time by any state where they invite the states to come. It's been a rarity since the mid-1800s. The last convention that was held was in 1861, where the states came together in an effort to try to stave off the Civil War. They came up with the proposal, they sent it to Congress. Congress didn't do anything about it, and the result was 600,000 people died. So we have a history of conventions. This past September, Arizona called a convention, and the purpose for the convention was to draft a set of rules that would govern a future Article 5 convention. And the reason they wanted to do that was they wanted a set of rules that would guarantee that no future convention could ever run away. That was the purpose of the call. There was all totaled some 27 states that attended that. From Georgia, it was Senator Huffstetler, Representative Barr, and myself. We were appointed by Senator Schaefer and Speaker Ralston to attend that convention. We did on our own dime, went out there to Arizona to represent Georgia. So that's the convention I'm talking about. We did come together, we drafted a set of rules. The rules provide, number one, that any convention is called, rule number one, must stick to the scope for which it's called. That's rule number one. Rule number two is rule number one can't be amended. And rule number three is rule number one can't be suspended. So there's no way to hold one of these conventions under that set of rules and it not be limited to the topic for which it's called.
Mr. Earhart, this will be the last one. We've got to go further.
Let me follow up on that.
Yes, sir.
two places. We heard in 2014 that the Article 5 convention would only, and 27 times again, only be for a balanced budget. And now, 3 years later, here comes another poll-tested group. Only one more. Next year, what's the, you've used the term runaway. I don't know if I want to call it runaway, but you're not going to be able to limit it. And you are aware that the Arizona Convention has no legal standing with respect to how an Article 5 convention's rules would be promulgated. It will be promulgated by the Article 5 convention if it ever gets there. So it's somewhat disingenuous, don't you think, to claim that a Arizona convention that has no basis in law with respect to the actual convention, if it ever happened, is drawing up a set of rules for the actual convention?
Yes, sir. You're correct that the convention that's called will adopt its own set of rules. What you may not be aware of is within our country and within the states, there are certain legislators that have become very attached.
I'm very aware of
Okay,
of
good.
that.
Then the group of people who met in Arizona, there's a good chance that virtually the vast majority, go ahead, you want to say
Based
something?
on what is there a good chance? If there was actually an Article 5 convention, you don't think there would be a lot of political interest of individuals, parties, everyone else, and who was actually going to attend that?
Oh, I absolutely think there would be. But again, I've had the benefit of talking to 26 speakers of the House and 26 presidents of the Senate, and a number of others that I've communicated with in many different ways. Focus on what Article 5 does. If 34 states call a convention for one purpose, 34 states call it for one purpose, which is to propose a term limits amendment. You have 34 legislatures responsible for appointing delegates. They may appoint you or Katie or some of these others here, people that are worried about that runaway. And when you go, you're not going to come back to your colleagues and say, oh, while I was there, I opened up this or opened up that or opened. You're not going to do that. And
Are you kidding? Given that ability to look at the
Gentlemen.
I'm sorry, Mr.
We're
Chairman.
done. We're done.
I'm good.
I would submit to you that the concept that a majority of delegations, that a majority of the people sitting in a delegation from a majority of states are going to go rogue is under the laws of physics impossible. I've seen it operate in action with real people involved, and I haven't seen it happen here in the years that I've been here, and I don't anticipate. Y'all follow the rules by and large, and the concept that a nationally exposed convention that a majority of the delegates in a majority of the states would go rogue, I submit to you, it's never happened in the history of this country, and I don't envision how it could possibly happen in the future.
Okay.
I don't.
That's all. We appreciate you being here. We've had the time. We don't have much time left in this session, so I would suggest that you just be on your toes, Mr. Huffstetler. Okay? Thank you for coming.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I'd just like to thank all the people that did come. There's some 50 more outside that support this effort, and we thank you for allowing us to have a hearing given the short amount of time. Thank you very much.
We thank you. We have one other piece of committee business on your desk. You've got House Resolution 1698, LC 363659. Have a move and a second. All those in favor signify by aye. Y'all pretty smart. It gives me a study committee. All right. Okay. Now we're going to go directly into Rules Committee. you people can line the wall now, and Jay can find his seat. Okay, here we go. Okay, here we go. Mr. Petrie.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm bringing to you under modified open rule, about 5 down, H.R. 1257. This is a study committee dedicated to the workforce shortage of caregivers in this state as we deal with, obviously, the demographics of increasingly more people to care for.
Any questions, Mr. Petrie? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Carter.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning. House Resolution 1416 is 9th down, just below the second hole. This is a House Study Committee on Bail Reform. I would ask that you would favorably pass this on. Thank you.
Any questions, Ms. Carter? No questions. Thank you. Mr. Belton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. About halfway down the first page, H.R. 1430 would urge the United States Air Force to bring the F-35 wing that Burlington and Vermont does not want and bring it down to Georgia.
This side of the room's moving already. I hadn't asked for that. I think it's, do we have questions? Is the next one. No questions. Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
Mr. Bodie. Dadgum, Mr. Bodie, how many times are you going to show up?
This is my third time, Mr. Chairman.
Oh,
Happy to be here.
You know the rules.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the Rule Committee. I'm coming to ask under modified open the second bill, H.R. 446. This is the Johnny Tolbert, the third House Study Committee on Heat Stroke and Cardiac Arrest Injuries in Youth and High School Sports. I will ask for your favorable consideration today.
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Elam and Ms. Light, y'all come to the front, please. Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of this committee. Mr. Chair, I come back before you again relative to H.R. 1540. As not on the calendar, was passed last week unanimously in the Special Rules Committee, and it's an urging resolution urging Congress to invest in our infrastructure from airports, water, sewer, roads, et cetera, to the tune of about over $200 billion, which would equate to a national investment of about $1.5 billion in our infrastructure.
No questions. Thank you, Mr. Elam.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Second page under modified structure, fourth one down, H.R. 1612. It's an urging resolution. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your support on this. For over 30 years, we had water that was polluted in a housing area at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. There's a lot of problems, medical problems, birth problems with that. The studies have been done. Actually, $2 billion have been appropriated. All our urgent resolution is to urge the federal government to continue to be focused on those dependents and those military retired personnel who served there during that 30-plus year period. I served there twice myself. I don't think I was affected, but I think my wife maybe thinks I was. Thank you.
Does that mean I was affected when I was there?
Sir, I understand you served during that period, but that's not my point by any means, sir.
Stupidity just bubbles right up, doesn't it?
Happened to me, sir.
No questions.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate you.
Ms. Lott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, I'm here to present SB 432. It is on the third page, midway down. SB 432 is our preceptor tax incentive program that we voted on last year in the House. It is an initiative of the Primary Care Summit, and it is also a recommendation of our Rural Council, as well as the Senate's Access to Quality Health Care initiative. And there's a portion on the back section that has another bill combined with it. And this bill gives some sales and use tax parity for the memberships on the gun clubs. No other membership that we know of, golf memberships, tanning memberships, no other memberships are requested to pay sales and use tax, but this one has been suggested. So we just did a little bit of parity there for that. And I have a second bill, if depending on questions.
Okay.
Second is actually a Tom Kirby bill, and he cannot be here today, but it is House Resolution 388. It's number 1 on the first page. And he has a House Study Committee created to study the demand for nursing in Georgia.
No questions, thank you. So on that first one, you're here doing Mr. Albert's job. Well, your name's still on it. You're going to get some credit here.
Yes.
All right, no question. Mr. Albers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Glad to help out any way that I can. On page 2, coming back for Senate Bill 324, first under modified structure rule, this is just allowing city and counties to partner on a bridge the way they do today for an intersection or a road. And then back to page 1, Senate Bill 319. I want to thank Chairman Smith for his assistance and wisdom. This is to move the fire marshal's office under fire standards and training.
I got a question. Mr. Earhart.
Senator Albers, it seems on its face that both these measures are excellent propositions, but it seems also that you and several others are very enamored of the concept of sunsets and reviews. Don't you think we should apply a review to statutory construction as well? So should we, I think an amendment to each of these with a 2-year sunset, maybe even a 3, and we'll see if it works well. And then if it doesn't, then it automatically sunsets and we can come back. Would you be willing to accept an amendment to sunset each of these?
I would always be willing to work with my friend Representative Earhart, and I would love to see the SSO go up to $250 million in the future.
But without a sunset.
Yeah,
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senate Bill 319. I didn't know I had a whole lot of wisdom. Most people don't say that. We modified that bill considerably in insurance. When if it passes the House and it goes back to the Senate, is this bill going to stay in its current form, or are you going to change it back to your original language?
Right now, I think we want to get this bill passed and moving, and I'd like to talk to you offline to figure if there's maybe even a little more of a compromise in between that.
Okay. Your original bill had 189 pages.
It could probably be less.
Okay.
Mr. A. Powell.
Thank you. Concerning SB 319, the original language of your insurance moving bill is being added to a House bill that some of us have an interest in. So with this bill moving, I don't guess you'd have any problems with us taking that off in the agrees, disagrees.
Well, I'd love to see us figure out how we can move both of them together and come up with a good answer, Mr. Chairman. I'd love to work with you on that.
Mr. Albers, I'm going to line up here with Mr. Smith. I don't want that, it sent back over there. It's got most of your stuff in there. I don't want it touched. No more questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee members.
Mr. Strickland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. On the last page, in a modified structure, about halfway down, I have Senate Bill 407, and this is the final piece of legislation from the Governor's Criminal Justice Reform Council.
Is there amendment on that thing?
There is an amendment dealing with e-filing that is also on here. Oh, is there amendment in rules? I believe there is.
Mr. Goley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment is on the desk. It's AM 29-2812-EC. Again, 2812-EC. There are two aspects. Do you want me to speak to the amendment, Mr. Chairman?
Please.
The two aspects of the amendment. The first on line 2 is just a technical fix, just an oversight by council, and that has to do with the e-filing portion that's on the bill. HB 15, which the House voted on long ago, is catching a ride on criminal justice reform 407 with the agreement of the administration. The other part of the amendment on line 3 is a clarification to ensure that if any sentence is waived or modified by the court, which it can do under current law, that they will not be able to waive the statutory surcharges that go along with the fine. We probably need to take a 50,000-foot look at statutory surcharges and how we're addressing those, but this is not the place to do it. We need to go ahead and make sure that those statutory surcharges are preserved so we don't have an administrative problem later on. That's been agreed to by the administration.
Y'all just hang tight a second. Mr. Goley, did you say there was two?
It was just two changes within the same amendment.
Okay.
But there's just the one amendment. I'd move on that at the appropriate time.
Right now is the appropriate time. You have a motion and a second to approve AM 292812 EC. All those in favor signify by aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? It's approved.
Thank you.
Mr. Heath.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I stand before you to request Senate Bill 257, Animal Cruelty Bill. It's on the first page, modified open, right below the third hole. Sorry.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Stone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Start on page 3. 3 bills from the bottom is Senate Bill 452. This is the bill that requires cooperation between local authorities and ICE on respecting ICE detainers and notifying ICE of the incarceration of illegal aliens. It has been amended in the House, and I support all the amendments. Be happy to answer questions.
I know I questioned you a little bit about
You
that.
did.
We're going to look at that again in just a little while.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The only other matter I have is on page 2 under modified open. It's the last matter Senate Resolution 774, co-sponsored by 55 senators, was a major, it removed opposition to passing House Bill 159, very important to allow both chambers to participate in determining guidelines and procedures for approving living expenses and adoptions for both agencies and private attorney adoptions.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Payne.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee. I'm here again also to request on the third page, the 12th bill down, Senate Bill 437, and the 15th bill down, Senate Bill 450. Senate Bill 437 is the clarification within the law on DNR orders, do not resuscitate orders on minor children, just to clarify the intent of the law, and then Senate Bill 450 is for the uniform code across the state for the unlawful enticement of game.
Ms. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to Senate Bill 437 at the proper time.
Now's the proper time.
Thank you, sir. It was a clarification that the hospitals asked for, just clarifying when a minor's what they do about ordering a not to resuscitate order.
On your desk, you got LC 298116S.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry.
Did y'all hear Ms. Cooper's explanation? I need a motion. All those in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. It's on. No more questions.
Thank you.
Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, I respectfully request 3 items for your favorable consideration. The first is a modified open rule, 5th from the bottom, page 1, Senate Bill 349. This allows notary publics to allow veterans' health identification cards as a valid, satisfactory evidence of their identification. The second is on page 2, second from the bottom, modified structure rule, Senate Bill 354. It, simple bill, it allows active duty service members as in-state residents for tuition purpose for technical college system. And also on the third page, second from the bottom, Senate Resolution 685. It renames a creek in Chatham County currently called Runaway Negro Creek. It renames it to Freedom Creek. Those are the 3 items that's on the sheet. There is one other item, Senate Bill 411, that's not on the blue sheet. It asks for a commission on African American history and cultural museum. I ask for your favorable consideration.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Harper.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I've been before your committee before to ask for both of these bills, but I'll be very brief. Both of them are under modified structure rule. The first one's on page 2, third up from the bottom, Senate Bill 348, dealing with campus police powers and campus police officers, mainly for the Technical College System of Georgia, and there were some changes made in the Public Safety Committee in the House in regards to some of the other provisions in that particular bill. And then on page 3, 1 to 4, 5 up from the bottom, Senate Bill 446, dealing with abandoned motor vehicles, and makes 2 changes in regards to authorized entities and derelict values. Those are the 2 bills.
Mr. Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a substitute drawn for 446. It contains the senator's bill as it came out of committee exactly, and I'm suggesting adding section 1 to take care of the unintended consequence a few years ago that these small electric golf carts are being charged a $200 fee to get a license tag. We've suggested that a low-speed vehicle and an electric-powered personal vehicle be charged $40 more in line with their road usage. Quite frankly, they don't use the road, and I appreciate the senator's helping us get that across the finish line. I can go into the definition of those vehicles if members would like. On a flat surface, they can't go more than 25 miles an hour, so they really don't use our roads, but we put the $40 fee in there to cover any administration for having to issue the license plate. The senator's bill is intact.
Mr. Fleming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To Representative Martin, you mentioned about the definition of those low-speed vehicles. Is that somewhere else in the code, or is that the Department of Revenue regulations?
Ma'am, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, it is in the code in Title 40, Article 1, specifically 25.1. Low-speed vehicle means a four-wheel electric vehicle whose top speed from 1 mile is greater than 20 and less than 25 miles an hour. And a similar definition for a personal transportation vehicle. It is defined in the code.
For the explanation, I assume Mr. Martin moves.
Yes, sir.
Do I hear a second? All those in favor of LC 345439S, the Martin amendment? All in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? It's on. Thank you, Mr. Harper.
Thank you.
Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I come with the annual road naming bill, SR 745, last one on your page. Bob Bell et al. That's about it.
We got Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to offer an amendment that's on the desk to AM 390237. This amendment simply addresses a road naming bill that was passed in May of 2017. The senator has agreed to ask that this be rescinded. It's part of the Tyler Perry Highway and dealt with at a different time.
You've heard Mr. Williams' explanation. It's on your desk. It's AM 390237. Mr. Williams makes a motion. Do I hear a second? All those in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Miller.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Brass.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to commend you on your style today, specifically your tie selections. Great selection.
Yours is pretty too.
Thank you. I bring to you Senate Bill 363 dealing with elections and uniformity of times and allowed to vote across the state. It's on page 2, very last one. And on page 3, it's right in the middle of the page, 9 up from the bottom, Senate Bill 430 dealing with our Constitutional Officers Association.
Mr. Trammell.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to offer for approval on both 363 and 430, but starting with Senate Bill 363, AM 281655. What the amendment would do is remove the language that pertains to advance voting. Specifically, the bill purports to change weekend voting to force local jurisdictions to choose either a Saturday or Sunday, removing that local control element. This amendment will remove provision from the bill.
Mr. Fleming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the minority leader, is it not my understanding that the senator's bill makes all voting in the state uniform for all municipalities, local governments, counties, and statewide? You, by offering this amendment, are going to undo that, and we'll go back to having different people voting at different times. Isn't that true?
The effect of the amendment is to maintain the present state of the law. So everyone will continue to do exactly what they do. With respect to the senator's bill as it came over from the Senate did not have the provision that this amendment seeks to remove, and this amendment would restore the senator's bill to the status that it was at when it came over from the Senate side.
And that status would be to maintain the unequal application of our voting laws across the state, and the changes to that Senate bill are going to make sure everybody votes at the same time. Isn't that correct?
Mr. Chairman, the effect of the amendment would be to provide jurisdictions who believe that they need voting for their citizens to continue to be able to do that in the counties that do that, and give citizens the opportunity to vote that they presently have, rather than restrict that in counties that presently have Sunday voting.
Okay.
Good talk.
AM 281655 on your desk. Do I hear a motion?
Move, Mr. Chairman.
Do I hear a second? Have a motion and a second. All those in favor signify by aye. All those opposed signify by aye. The amendment is beat 10.
Mr. Chairman, if I might.
Mr. Trammell?
I have an amendment to offer for approval on Senate Bill 430, which is AM 281648, offered by me and Representative Blackman, who is carrying the bill in the House for Senator Brass. The effect of this amendment is there's a provision in the bill that purports to change the way that compensation increases that are voted on by county commissioners take effect. The effect in the bill would basically be that after a pay raise is voted on for commissioners who have staggered terms, those who receive a full 4-year term after the general election receive the pay increase, but those who remain on the staggered term do not. So you have a disparate treatment in the way those commissioners would be compensated. Would also note that that is different than the way that cities would be treated under the code. The effect of this amendment would be to remove that provision from the bill.
Mr. Fleming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of things. Number one, Mr. Leader, is it not true that first time you got it wrong, but this time you got it right?
If the gentleman so states.
In all seriousness, the senator who came over and offered this amendment in committee that's being Senator Miller, has recognized that there were some unintended consequences of his action, and he has also asked us to support your amendment removing the additions he made in committee, so I support your amendment.
Either one of y'all got a pink tie on? Mr. Burns said we were having a love fest back there. All right, I'm going to assume that you moved. Do I hear a second? You got a second? AM 281648. All those in favor signify by aye. Those opposed, same sign. It's okay. You're done, Bubba.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Gooch.
Good morning.
Good
Mr.
morning.
Chairman and Chairman in the committee. I have 3 bills on your blue sheet. On page 3, all 3 are listed on page 3. SB 366 deals with local governments and salary studies for law enforcement at the local level. SB 426 is the Broadband Infrastructure Leads to Development Act, which is dealing with small cell technology for cell phone carriers here in Georgia. And SB 445 is a Department of Transportation housekeeping bill we have routinely every year.
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Thompson.
Morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. On page 2, we have Senate Bill 315. It's our unauthorized access to a computer. So I request your permission to be able to move forward.
No questions.
Then on the following page, which is in page 3, we have Senate Bill 403. It's just a little election bill that we've been working on.
I think maybe something's in the works on that one. No
Thank you.
questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you look in your packet, LC 345436S is a substitute for Senate Bill 367. It's a military-friendly bill, and that any department or agency is authorized to deduct voluntarily amounts from salaries for those who've served in the armed forces to provide insurance benefits to such employees. And Representative Jason Shaw's request. Number 6, Mr. Willard.
Mr. Willard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On your desk is a committee substitute we're proposing on Senate Bill 338. It is LC 298119S. What comes in as a change, two things. On page 6, we have additional, we call emergency need of rulemaking, which addresses bills that we pass that need to have rules implemented. They can be done so the same year the bill is passed, provided they get the approval of the governor, and we will still have the right to review those come the next session, but they could be implemented in the meantime. The other thing is we had some problems with apparently cross-referencing, getting some sections removed that were also in the bill. You look on page 9, there's a cross-reference there that is taking out part of it. Then over on page 10, a long section is being removed that was left in inadvertently in the code. That is the changes made, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Mr. Coomer, is that on this one? No, let's stop. We got ahead of ourselves.
I move on my substitute.
Let's go back to Mr. Smith's substitute, LC 345436S for 367.
Move.
All those in favor signify by aye. Aye. Okay. Any opposed? All right. Now go back to Mr. Willard's. Do we have questions on Mr. Willard's bill? Mr. Fleming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Willard, I appreciate your work on this bill and understand, I believe, what you're doing there, and it's actually answering some of the questions that folks had about the bill. On page 10, however, and I apologize for not being able to ask you this before, but section 2.2, line 321, I was trying to understand what that subsection did. It doesn't have action language in line 321 through 323. Are we striking? Are we adding? May have been an oversight. Either I'm reading it wrong.
I'm trying to recall, Mr. Fleming, what the change there was from the original bill, I believe. That section was already in the bill.
If you look at line
335.
Line 335's got the change.
But my point, Mr. Witt, was on line 321 through 323. That's where we, legislative councils, are we revising or striking or adding a new section? There's no action language there.
I'm sorry, I see now what the change was made was a reference to a subsection B, which is now a subsection F of that code section 501314. So the only thing you had changed was the reference of the letter of the code section. on
So
335.
we're
That's
just
all we're
changing
saying.
a number basically for reference
Exactly.
purposes?
That's all
Okay,
we're
there's no
saying.
action there other than that. Thank you, sir.
No, sir. Excuse me.
All right, on your desk, LC 298119S, substitute for 338. Mr. Willard, do you move? Do I hear a second?
Second.
Mr. Hawkins?
Yeah, excuse me, Mr. Chairman. I had a question for the author. Can I ask
Okay.
a quick question?
Yep.
Chairman Willard, on line 193, I'd like your expert opinion on what constitutes public health emergency. I'm not sure this code section 3833, but as of this morning's news, 1,000 people were exposed to hepatitis by DSO. That's a dental service clinic. Our dental board or any medical board may need to move on rules a little bit quicker. So does this allow this public health emergency, does that allow them to adopt a rule within 30 days and not have to wait?
It does. It
Thank you.
continues the same standards now for that particular type need.
Great, thank you.
All those in favor, never mind, whoa, Mr. Govett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick, appreciate it, just a quick clarifying question to Chairman Willard. Can you just very briefly speak to the ability, does the substitute that we have in front of us add or subtract to the legislature's ability to have oversight and act as a check on an executive level agency in the event that agency, whether it's the administration or an elected department head, a constitutional officer, sometimes, as we know, regulations are promulgated and rules are promulgated that may expand beyond the scope of power that's been given to that agency by statute.
Mr. Golick, I don't know, you phrased that question a little bit funny. You asked Mr. Willard if he could quickly speak.
I thought I was in trouble there, Mr.
I would give
Chairman.
a quick answer too. I think that's the purpose of the bill.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we're preserving our ability to have that check,
much.
to have that oversight in the event that an executive level agency, whether a constitutional officer or otherwise, may go beyond the scope of their statutory authority.
Yes, it does.
That's pretty quick. Okay. Anybody else got a question on that particular sub? All those in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? Okay. Mr. Williams standing over there like a lonely little old puppy, so we're going to let him go. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I have a substitute for Senate Bill 385. This will be LC 440939S. This is the bill that allows the chief medical examiner of the GBI to inter their skeletal remains.
Good sub. Do I hear a motion on Mr. Williams' sub? All those in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? It's okay. Thank you, Mr. Williams.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Mr. Coomer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment for Senate Bill 427 that is updates to provisions relating to child support enforcement and child support recovery. And the amendment is AM 292817. And that amendment incorporates language from House Bill 654 into Senate Bill 427. 654 was the annual child support update that was recommended by the Commission and adopted by the House that did not get onto the Senate rules calendar.
Mr. Setzler, you got a question on the bill? Anybody have a question of Mr. Coomer on his substitute? No question. Do I hear a move, Mr. Coomer?
Move.
All those in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? It's okay. Mr. Setzler.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask the committee's consideration for SB 154. That's on the middle of the second page. It's been a multi-year effort for us. This is a bill that cleans up the code with respect to unlawful sexual contact between teachers and students and allows us to prosecute people who currently can't be prosecuted for misconduct. Passed unanimously out of Judiciary Non-Civil.
Any questions, Mr. Setzler? No questions.
Mr. Chairman, if I could also ask for SB 437, good parental rights bill that puts parents back in the decision-making process of do not resuscitate orders.
Ms. Cooper?
I'd like to ask for House Bill, Senate Bill 325, and I have an amendment at the time. That's the one that has Representative Dempsey's bill on it for continuing the study of the weight loss surgeries, and it also has the important bill of step therapy, so trying to get patients not to have to fail on their medicines several times before they get to the one that works. I have the amendment at the proper time.
On your desk, you've got AM 33-1791.
Yes, sir. And the insurance companies just asked that if it's not an emergency, which still has a 24-hour period for them the insurer to respond to the patient, if it's not an emergency situation, they would have 3 business days to respond for an appeal, about an appeal.
Ms. Dempsey, you have a question on that bill? Okay. All right, you've heard Ms. Cooper's explanation, AM 33-1791. Do I hear a move, Ms. Cooper? Got a all those in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? Okay. Ms. Dempsey.
Yes, sir. I just want to also support that measure as well. It's very important, both of the bills that are incorporated into SB 325.
Mr. Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask for H.R. 1417. Hasn't made it to the blue sheet yet. But this is a resolution, House resolution for a House Study Committee on cannabis oil and the benefits to the sickest folk or those people in Georgia that would benefit from that. Currently, HB 65 is in the agrees, disagrees, I believe, and that's the one calls for joint study committee. And I understand these things that's going to be added that may or may not be acceptable across the whole. So we're doing this as a House study committee as a backup to HB 65 in case it does not make it.
Okay. Okay, Mr. J. Powell. It's 432. Sonia. Jody Lotz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's an amendment on your desk on Senate Bill 432. It's LC 345438S. And this adds the preceptor tax bill that we passed out of this House last year and has been languishing in the Senate. It adds that language onto, or substitutes that language in this bill. And it also adds a sales tax exemption for membership to a shooting range.
You got it on your desk, LC 345438S. Do I hear a second? All those in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? Got one opposition. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask for
SB 407, Senator Strickland's bill, and also SB 315, Senator Thompson's bill.
Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask for H.R. 1430, Representative Belton, and additionally H.R. 1612, Representative Elam, and S.R. 685. I think my seatmate has agreed to drop his amendment, and Freedom Creek is on the horizon.
Mr. Trammell.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to ask for House Resolution 446, Representative Bodie's bill, and House Resolution 1416, Representative Carter's bill.
Mr. Hawkins.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to ask for SB 325, step therapy, very much needed in this state.
Nobody else? Okay. Y'all, this is going to be a long day, and we're going to make it even longer right here. This is the supplemental calendar for today. Under modified open, H.R. 1198. Do I hear a second? Have a move and a second. All those in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? It's on. Modified open, H.R. 1257. All those in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? So, modified open, H.R. 1430. All those in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? So, modified open, SB 319. All those in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? Modified open, SB 364. All those in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? It's on. Second page, modified structure, H.R. 1429. All those in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? It's on. Modified structure, H.R. 1612. All those in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? It's on. Modified structure, SB 154. All those in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? Modified structure, SB 315. All those in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? So, modified structure, SB 324. All those in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? It's on. Modified structure, SB 325, and it's amended, remember that. All those in favor signify by aye. Maybe that one got the best. Yeah, y'all are here. Any opposed? its own. Page 3. SB 369. Any opposed? Its own. SB 407. Again, that's an amended version. All those in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? Its own. SB 432. I think there might be an amendment to that, or a sub to that one. All those in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? Its own. SB 445. All in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? Its own. And SR 745 amended, that's the one where we subtracted Mr. Williams. All those in favor signify by aye. Any opposed? Its own. That probably going to get you to 11:30, and I will not promise that you will not have another one for today.